Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. So, let me keep picking up. We're talking about turning points. Okay, so until the last episode, I'm mainly focused on turning points for us as individuals. But I want to take a slightly different approach in this particular podcast and lay down some of the seeds for us to think about in terms of turning points in our community, in our society, but also turning points potentially from a historical basis as well. One of the things that I've been watching very, very closely, mainly because of my interest in behaviours, all things masculine, about the re-emergence of the strongman in the last probably 10 to 15 years. And I talk about that this last decade has almost given dictators permission to come out of the woodwork and establish themselves again. Okay? Now you might be going, how's this all fit together with, becoming great men or good men becoming great? Well, it's a very important point because my premise fundamentally is that patriarchy needs to be deconstructed so that we as men can step into a much more powerful masculinity than what we've been socialized into. Now, some of you might disagree with that. I know that some of you like to still cling on and perpetuate the myth of the alpha male and the male version of the hero's journey. And I'm not saying that there isn't a hero's journey, but it's not always male, although we have had a tendency in the media, fiction and otherwise, to really portray the male heroic figure. Now, there's several problems with that. I won't go necessarily into those right away. But as I said, in founding Making Good Men Great, one of my aims was to get us as men to think about the constraints that patriarchy puts on us, how it socializes us and how it separates us from one another, not just from women or children, but from each other. It's not unusual for men to continue to feel uncomfortable with a certain level of physical closeness to men. We hug, but then we very brutishly slap each other on the back just to make sure that the other bloke doesn't get the wrong impression that, if it's a little bit too light, that I might be gay or that I might be transgender. I need to firm my masculinity in that space. And so a lot of stuff then gets articulated into sport. And so our repression of our own emotions needs to find a way to express itself. Now, unfortunately, the traditional patriarchal maleness has a tendency towards aggression and violence. And, I can write a whole book just on that thing alone. But what I want to make very clear is that as long as we keep focusing solely on the idea of men's mental health as an individual endeavour rather than a social reconstruction, we're going to miss the boat, and we're going to miss it badly. For lots and lots of reasons, I think that we're at a turning point in history here that we either pick up on constructively, or it can potentially take us down a very, very dark path, and as some people have expressed, with the potential of extinction. One of the things that's taught us it's been taught to us since the whole COVID epidemic, is that, when human beings reduce their activity levels in terms of, using fossil fuels, reducing their energy footprint and so on, the rest of the planet actually picks up quite quickly. Animals appear where they haven't been for a long, long time. Birds who have not sung a particular song in urban environments because of the background noise are singing again. Now, you might say, well, that's a bit trivial. Why focus on that? Well, my response to that is that to not be concerned about our ecology is buying into the patriarchal ideology of, dominance. That I dominate the planet, I dominate the ecology, and it's there for me to exploit, rather than for me to take a much more ecological perspective and say, from where I sit, we're actually stewards. My aim is to leave a legacy for my children that fundamentally is healthy. Now, in Australia, a bunch of kids or teenagers took, the politicians to court, and even though they didn't win the case on, its merits of politicians making decisions that are against, the well-being of the ecology is actually threatening their well-being, the judge was extremely clear about what he thought about the lack of response by the politicians and the corporate leaders to this particular problem. Now, I can go into more detail, and I probably will in another podcast following, I suspect, this one. But right now, one of the things that I want to focus on is this question of why right here and now in our history, is democracy under threat? And it is. You don't have to be overly educated to see that we've got a really serious problem going, and especially it's located within the sort of hubs of what we've seen as democratic countries, the UK and the United States, two countries that have fought desperate wars against fascism and against communism, although that one was much more of a Cold War, but it was played out in different arenas. So why is it that in particularly those countries are struggling with this emergence of the strongman, the sort of patriarchal approach to politics, which is deeply entrenched in a binary, conflict-based, competitive view of how life in general should work? Now, one of my arguments with this is that it's my opinion that patriarchy and democracy can't actually coexist happily. In fact, it's an oxymoron. You can't have a binary social system that is the ruled and the rulers working together and pretending that the system, the society and the organisation is an equitable arrangement. One of the things that keeps persistently coming to my attention as I review, the media and political scientists is that our system is really, in a sense, not based on solid, firm democratic principles where we talk about human beings as being equal. Now, some of you might argue, well, that's, of course, natural. There is a natural hierarchy in the organisation of human culture. And my argument is that that's not true. That problem is that hierarchy is only, in fact, potentially, the way we practice it, a relatively new social construct. My argument is, and so a lot of scholars have said, is that it comes back down to the emergence of agriculture. Once agriculture came into place, hierarchies in human culture became, definitely manifest in a way that we hadn't seen before amongst hunter-gatherers. Okay, so part of that in my argument is that, well, by definition, agriculture requires the ownership of territory. That gives you status. That means you might want to get more because that gives you more status. And so eventually you end up competing and being in conflict with others who have got the same aim. Right? We're not working together here. It's me versus them. Okay? So the ruler and the ruled can't effectively live in an equitable relationship because it's unequal by definition. And patriarchy sorted itself out that by and large it said that, all men are equal, but we sort of leave out, women, we leave out minorities because it's really about the boys' club and who belongs to what club in that sense. So, again, for those of you who probably haven't used that word patriarchy all that much, let me give you a little bit of sort of an insight in some of the definitions, okay? So the obvious one that a lot of people go to would be Wikipedia. And it says that patriarchy is defined as a social system in which men hold primary power and predominate in roles of political leadership, moral authority, social privilege, and control of property. Okay? Now, that's not a bad definition in the sense, but I think there's some stuff missing here. But one of the things I appreciate about that definition is that it doesn't buy into a binary gender relationship, because we can see that under those four values of territoriality, hierarchy, acquisition, and competitiveness, a lot of women can be as fierce in upholding those values as men. All right, so that's an important fact to hold in mind as we're exploring this further. So my definition of patriarchy was that it is a system, an ideology that is based on territoriality, on status and hierarchy, on the acquisition of power and material wealth, and the competitiveness to gain those. Now, again, academically, I could be open to all sorts of arguments, and I could be open to all sorts of critique. But the thing that I want to really bring this to the pointy end with is that democracy is based on inclusivity. It's based on the respect for difference, and it's based on the capacity to distribute what the community needs in an egalitarian way, and it does so through cooperation. Okay, now, people criticise capitalism for being patriarchal, and in some ways the way it's practiced, it has been. But I don't see any reason why we can't have a democratic capitalist system, economic system. Ultimately, it's simply a relationship between two people wherein they work on the basis of what each of them needs and having a fair exchange and moving on. Currently there's this big question about why aren't people taking up lowly paid jobs? Well, because those lowly paid jobs actually don't give them what they need. I'm sure that there wouldn't be a shortage of work if you paid them a decent amount of money. Okay, so let me come back to the original proposition, that is that patriarchy and democracy are not good bedfellows. And so in that contest, and it is a contest, what's going to win out? The tradition of essentially 10,000 years of being indoctrinated and socialised as men being in charge over and in control of, or do we move into that democratic space? Now, democracy emerged in Greece, but it was a very limited democracy. You had to be landowning and Greek and male. Everybody else was excluded. So we looked at a very